Hello, and welcome to Scoring the Score, where we talk about movie, television, and video game soundtracks. I am your host, Ashlyn. Since this is the first episode, I'd like to introduce myself. I recently graduated from film school and have been a musician all my life. I love listening to movie soundtracks and always enjoy a movie when it has an amazing movie soundtrack. My favorite movie soundtracks are always changing, but currently my top 3 favorite soundtracks, not in any particular order, are How to Train Your Dragon by John Powell, Lincoln by John Williams, and The Patriot by John Williams. And speaking of John Williams, today is John Williams' birthday. John Williams is turning 93 years old today, so happy birthday, John Williams. I hope you have an amazing day, and thank you so much for giving us so many amazing film scores and pieces of music throughout the years. Since it is John Williams' birthday, I thought that I would talk a little bit about why 2 of my top 3 favorite soundtracks currently are 2 of his scores. Lincoln and The Patriot, I think they're in my top 2 right now for similar reasons. I love how Americana and patriotic they sound. I especially love the Patriot soundtrack right now because of how lyrical and all of the horn lines that are in it. And then there are some brass chorales in the Patriot soundtrack that are super beautiful. Sometimes I listen to those brass chorales just by themselves. That's how good they are. And then with Lincoln, again, very Americana. I love how John Williams utilizes the woodwinds in that one. As a woodwind player, I think I like that especially. There's a lot of flute and clarinet in that one. Also, beautiful, beautiful trumpet solos in the soundtrack to Lincoln. Probably some of the best trumpet solos. Anyway, so those are some of my favorite John Williams soundtracks currently. He has many other amazing soundtracks, many that are very famous, like Star Wars and Jurassic Park and Harry Potter, and some lesser known ones. I think one of my favorite lesser known ones, probably Lincoln. I don't know how well known that one is. I think one of my other favorite John Williams soundtracks that's maybe a lesser known movie is the soundtrack to AI. That soundtrack is just kind of magical and whimsical and a little sad and heart-touching. If you've ever seen the movie, you would understand why. It's a play on the story of Pinocchio, but it's about a boy who is a robot and he wants to become a real boy. But the soundtrack to that movie is just so beautiful. If you have a favorite John Williams soundtrack, let me know down in the comments because I would love to know what your favorite soundtrack is. And be sure to wish John Williams a happy birthday today. The main part that I wanted to talk about in this episode today is the Golden Globes, specifically the nominees and winners for Best Original Score. Now, the Golden Globes were just a couple of weeks ago, and since then I've had an opportunity to listen to the entire soundtracks of each film that was nominated, and I gave each one a score. And I just kind of want to explain how I've scored these beforehand. So I gave each track a score out of 10, and I'm not going to go through what I gave each track. I'll just give you the average of what I gave each track. And then I also gave a score on the musicality overall on the score, and then how much I felt like the score told a story through just the music. Because I feel like in film, there are so many parts that go into creating a film and telling a story, and it's more than just the screenplay, the script, that is telling the story. The cinematography has to tell a story. The costume design has to tell a story. And especially the music has to tell a story. And I think when you're listening to a movie soundtrack by itself, you want to be able to also feel like you're on whatever journey that story was taking you on. And so for me, it's really important that you hear that in the soundtrack itself without having seen the movie. there should be some story that you are taking from that. So I gave a score out of 10 for story. And then I also gave a score out of 10 on how much I enjoyed listening to the soundtrack. I think many times in these award shows when they are looking at best soundtrack, they are looking at the movie as a whole and how the soundtrack contributed to the movie. But I do think there's some value in looking at the soundtrack by itself and then kind of basing some things off of that. And again, a lot of this is also based on my own opinion. And so if you have listened to any of these soundtracks and you have different opinions than me, that's totally fine. I mean, we all have our own different tastes in music and things that we know about music and stuff like that. And so again, these are all based on my own opinion. But now that I've gotten how I'm going to score that out of the way, let's get into it. So the Golden Globe nominees for Best Original Score this year were Challengers, Emilia Perez, Conclave, Dune Part 2, The Wild Robot, and The Brutalist. So the winner of the Golden Globe for Best Original Score was Challengers. So let's start with that one. The Challengers score was kind of interesting to me. I felt like a very clear theme with how the score was composed. Going into this, I do know a little bit about some of the movies. And so I know Challengers is a tennis movie. And so while I was listening to this soundtrack, I definitely felt like the music fit. I felt like the music fit for scenes where the main character might have been on the tennis court training or in tournaments, things like that. I wasn't a super huge fan of the tennis racket and tennis ball noises in the soundtrack. Personal opinion, I'm not a huge fan of sound effects in soundtracks. I would rather just listen to the music itself. Anyway, so I think there was a story there with having music set on, athletes training, athletes in a tournament. It kind of was getting that vibe. But it kind of felt like that specific musical theme. I don't know if I want to say musical theme, but like that first track was kind of repeated throughout the whole movie. And so it made the soundtrack feel kind of monotonous. Now, there were a couple tracks that were some nice, like, piano stuff. And I thought that was kind of nice, but still, again, it was a little boring. Wasn't super interested in some of that. My two favorite tracks from this soundtrack were Friday Afternoons and Friday Afternoon 2. And I think part of that was because these felt a little more orchestral and lyrical and musically felt like they had more form to them instead of being the more hip-hop, I'm at the tennis court training for a tournament. So my average score, after going through and scoring each track, my average score, I gave it a 3.5 out of 10 from each track. For musicality, I gave it a 3 out of 10. Part of that was because of how monotonous the soundtrack kind of was. It just kind of droned in my ear. Didn't really hear a lot of musical complexity except for the two soundtracks that I gave a higher score on that I liked the best. For story, I also gave it a 3 out of 10. I haven't seen this movie, and so I don't know how the movie flows or what the storyline is. But I couldn't really glean any sort of story from this soundtrack other than I'm at the tennis court training for a tournament. And that's all I got. And so because of that, I only gave it a 3. I wish I would have been able to pull some more storyline progression, and kind of get a feel for a little more of what the movie was about. But I didn't quite get that. And then for how much I liked the soundtrack, I also gave it a 3 out of 10. The soundtrack was fine to listen to. The first track was fine. I thought it was cool, and then it just was like the same after that for everything. And so it just kind of felt like it was a little bit of lazy writing on the composer's part for this soundtrack. And so overall, the Challenger score for me got a 3.1 out of 10. So that was the Golden Globe winner. You can take what you want from that information. Next, let's move on to The Brutalist. I don't really know anything about the film, and so just going off of the music, I did like the main theme that was played in the brass. I thought that was kind of cool. And then there was one track that had some really nice jazz stuff. It's the track New York. I really liked the jazz in that. Again, this soundtrack kind of suffered from the same thing as the Challengers score, where I felt like there were too many motifs and songs that were overused, and so the soundtrack as a whole felt kind of monotonous again. There was a little bit more variation because we had like the main theme, and then there was some piano stuff, which the piano stuff was kind of interesting. Some of it was nice, and some of it was like we're just listening to some guy just tinker on the piano. And so I don't know how interesting that is to listen to, looking at this as just a purely musical standpoint, not thinking about what's happening in the movie. So that was kind of interesting to listen to. And then there's some jazz settings that we get. And again, there was one that I really liked. I thought that the way the jazz was composed was really well done. There were others that, again, I don't know what happens in the movie, but there were other jazz stuff that sounded like they gave third graders, they handed a bunch of third graders a saxophone, a drum set, and a trumpet and said, here, play this. And they've never touched those instruments before. And so that was also very interesting to listen to. Separate from the movie, that just wasn't doing it for me. And so this soundtrack, my overall average score from each track got a 3.7 out of 10. For musicality, I gave this a 2 out of 10, partly because of the jazz sections that just sounded like elementary school kids playing on instruments for the first time, and other things like the main theme repeating and being very simple. There just didn't seem to be as much musical complexity, and not that there has to be musical complexity in everything. I just was a little unimpressed with how this soundtrack was composed. For story, I gave this one a 4 because I could get a little bit more of a storyline progression through listening to this soundtrack, more than I could with Challengers, but still there wasn't much there that I could get. It was really towards the end that I started getting some more like, oh, I can kind of understand what might be happening in this movie, or there's a story here. Everything else was like, it just kind of felt like noise. For how much I liked the soundtrack, I gave it a 3 out of 10. Again, this soundtrack just kind of sounded like noise, was a little monotonous, wasn't super interesting, nothing that I particularly liked. And so this got a 3.1 out of 10, same as Challengers. So Conclave is the one I'm going to talk about next. This soundtrack was actually kind of cool in how it was done. I really liked the cello being the main instrument in the soundtrack, but I didn't like, again, was kind of the same thing throughout the whole movie. And so there's some things that I was like, we've heard this before, or this track is just kind of a bunch of nothing. It's just a note being held. But this soundtrack did seem to have a little bit more musicality with it. The credits, the postlude of Conclave that played during the credits, that track was awesome. Very classical, very musical, still had some of the themes that were in the movie. My only problem is that it felt so different than what the rest of the soundtrack is, and I would have liked a little more of what was in the credit soundtrack in the rest of it, and then I think it would have gotten a higher score, just because there was so much good stuff in that credit song. The average score from each track was a 4.3 out of 10. For musicality, I gave it a 6 out of 10. Story was also a 6 out of 10. You could really get a sense of what this movie was about, and the tension and the conspiracy and the sneaking around, not that there was much sneaking around. I guess there was, I have seen this movie, so there was a little sneaking around, but you kind of got an idea of what this movie was about, and you could tell that there was a progression through the movie. You could figure out a story from the whole soundtrack. And so this one got a 6 out of 10 for me. How much I liked it, I gave it a 5 out of 10. It might have gotten a lower score if it wasn't for that last track. Again, like with the other two, most of the soundtrack was just a lot of the same stuff and was just kind of a little boring and monotonous and wasn't something that I would add to my movie soundtrack playlist, except for that last track. That one is definitely going on my movie soundtrack playlist. So overall, this score got a 5.3 out of 10, which is already much better than Challengers and The Brutalist. If I were to be giving a Golden Globe to one of these three, just talking about these three, it would have gone to Conclave, not Challengers. But we still have 3 more soundtracks to look at, and so let's continue on. Next we have Dune Part 2. I have not seen either parts of Dune, so I don't know much about the story, what happens in the film. But there were parts of the soundtrack that I really liked. There were some very nice moments where I could tell, oh, there's probably 2 people that are really connecting here, talking with each other. And then there was some nice stuff like battling and everything. I'm assuming there's battles in Dune. I've seen trailers for it, so, you know, there's battles on the sand. But then there were some other tracks that were, it literally felt like it was just a single note being held, and I was like, why have we put this in the soundtrack? Like, sometimes when you're watching a movie, there's soundtrack in the movie that doesn't get put in the actual, like, one that you can listen to on Apple Music or Spotify or buy a CD of. And there were a couple tracks in here that I felt like shouldn't have been on here because they were just like notes being held out for 2 whole minutes. And so there wasn't anything substantive there that would warrant wanting to be listened to. That's just my opinion with that. I like that Hans Zimmer was able to incorporate some instruments that we don't usually hear, and it made it feel like this movie was happening on another planet. So I thought that was really nice. My average score from each track was a 4.4. For musicality, I gave it a 5, and I think the 5 mostly came from a lot of the tracks just felt like it was one note being held out, and so there wasn't really anything there to judge off of. Hans Zimmer, do better next time with those. For story, I gave it a 6. I could definitely tell that there was a story here, that things were happening. I could get a nice storyline progression leading up to a climax. I could hear a resolution. So story was, I gave it a 6. The only reason it didn't get higher than that was, again, I think just some of those tracks were just super flat. And how much I liked it was 5. This isn't my favorite Hans Zimmer score ever, and so this one didn't really win me over. I know a lot of people really like this score. It gets used in a lot of Instagram reels and stuff like that, and I can see why. There were some tracks in here that I was like, yeah, I would definitely use that for different things. But as a whole, the soundtrack didn't really catch my interest. So overall, this got a score of 5.1. So next, let's talk about Emilia Perez. So for this soundtrack, I only listened to the ones that that weren't like the musical songs that didn't have singing in them. I really wanted to focus on just the score part of this soundtrack. And this soundtrack was really boring to me. And there were a couple tracks in here that had talking in them, which I really don't like, and those ones automatically got a score of 1 from me, because I'm here to listen to the music, not listen to people talk. So that's my reasoning for giving those a score of 1. Overall, this soundtrack was just kind of boring. again, monotonous. What is it with these monotonous soundtracks that have been nominated for this? There just wasn't a lot that happened in these soundtracks. Like, they were kind of nice. There were some that were nice and sounded kind of pretty, but it just wasn't anything that happened. Nothing really substantive that came from them. For an average score from each track, I gave it a 3.1. Musicality, I gave it a 3. Story, I gave it a 2. From just the soundtrack, I could not get like any sort of story whatsoever. It just all sounded the same. It was like I was listening to the same song the whole time. So I didn't really get much from it. How much I liked it, I gave it a 2. It was a very boring soundtrack. Like, I wouldn't even listen to it to study. So overall, this got a 2.5 out of 10, which I think is the lowest score that I've given so far. So that one, definitely, I don't even know why that got nominated. A terrible score. Now let's go into The Wild Robot. I really liked this soundtrack. It wasn't anything like How to Train Your Dragon or other DreamWorks movies that have been made, but it did still feel like a DreamWorks soundtrack. It had multiple themes in it, and it used those themes in very specific ways. I was really able to get a story from this soundtrack, and it was enjoyable to listen to. So overall, the average score from each track, I gave it a 7.1 out of 10. I think the lowest score a track got was, there's a couple 6s in here, and those particular tracks weren't anything super exciting. For musicality, I gave it an 8, and I felt like overall this movie did have really good musicality, had good musical themes. It was composed really well. My only complaint with it is there were a couple times where the writing did feel a little lazy. For example, Chris Bowers used an ostinato for a main theme, and I felt like it kind of got overused a little bit. And then there were some other things that I was like, oh, this would be a really good spot to put the main theme, or I kind of wish that Roz's theme was used a little bit more. I wanted to hear it a little more. So they used this song called, I believe it's the Even When I'm Not by Maren Morris. I don't remember which part of the film that was used in. But there is a track at the end of the soundtrack that uses that theme from that song. And I really liked how that theme was used, but it was only used in that one track. And I think it would have been cool to use that theme in other places in the soundtrack as well, just to kind of add a little more variety to the themes and give us a little bit more melodic lines rather than just the ostinato we kind of got through a lot of it. But that would be my only complaint with how it was scored. For story, I could listen to this and totally figure out what the story was or create my own story around it. There was a very clear storyline. If any of you are interested in film analysis, I have another channel where I talk about how movies fit into the 3-act film structure, particularly with character-based writing. And this soundtrack, I could tell where each act was happening, what the characters' motivations were, that kind of stuff. And so story, 9 out of 10. And then how much I liked it, I gave it an 8 out of 10. The reason it didn't go past an 8 is for some of the musicality reasons I talked about earlier, just some of the overuse of ostinatos and just a couple things that I would have liked a little more from the score. But overall, I really enjoyed this score. So overall, this score got an 8.025 from me. So looking at all of these scores together, The Wild Robot should have won, in my opinion, the Golden Globe for Best Original Score. I don't know what basis they were basing these on. I know with award shows, a lot of it is a popularity contest and people will go and try to campaign and get people to vote for them. So it's possible that's what happened here with Challengers, but I do think that The Wild Robot was the deserving soundtrack in this case. But yeah, those are my thoughts about the Golden Globes. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought about the Golden Globes, what you thought about these particular soundtracks. If there's something in these soundtracks that maybe I missed that was super awesome, let me know. Or if you totally agree with me, let me know down in the comments. Anyway, so that's all for this first episode of Scoring the Score. I hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you so much for watching.